troublemakers, I can tell. Especially this guy right here, Mr. Hack. Somebody let him in. He's the only person who beat the person next to him, I should say. Hey, Richard.
Hey, buddy. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I am in awe of this crowd and its enthusiasm.
Yeah, and you know what I'm in awe of? Portland. This is a weird and cool city, do you think? Yeah. Have you guys ever heard of four-way intersections? No. What is with only stop signs going one direction? What is up with that? Yeah, you got to be careful. If you're from the East Coast and you come out here, you expect a stop sign on all four roads, on all four directions, right? No. And every other one. It's not enough that there's only two. Now they stagger it. So one block you have a stop sign, the next one the other guy has a stop sign. Oh my God, how do you people drive? Yeah, great. All right, well, at least you got rain, so you got that going for you. Mr. Campbell.
Sir.
We are here at .NET Fringe, thanks to Glenn Block and Troy. Troy. I'll say that again. Sorry, Troy. For some reason I had Trey Anastasia. Maybe you look like fish or something. I don't know. Here we go. Big thanks to Glenn and Troy. It's been a great show. Hey, buddy, I'm going to turn it over to you to read the comment before I do Better Know Framework, because I got to find it.
Okay, comment first. And this comment is from show 1107, the one we did with Mads Christensen when we talked about ASP.NET vNext, very open source appropriate. This comment comes from Andrei Rusiek, who says, you're going to love this. Visual Studio has been my favorite IDE for many years now, and I'm really glad to hear its web dev experience is getting better and better. I enjoy using it on my side projects, but now that I've strayed from the .NET world for my day job, I really miss it. However, with all the changes happening at Microsoft, particularly around .NET, I think Visual Studio is starting to show its age and could benefit from being the next product to go through a major overhaul. On the surface, Visual Studio looks great and supports more and more features, but when one starts to look into extensibility, the experience is rather dreadful. Documentation is poor and often vague. Do I use the managed framework that was released when Visual Studio hit RTM and has never been updated since? Or do I work with the COM object stuff? Is life too short for COM? I think life's too short for COM. It takes a lot of time and effort to become good at extending Visual Studio, and I don't think this compares favorably with the likes of GitHub's Atom, which runs on all platforms, including most of its plugins. It's nice to see support coming along for things like Grunt, Gulp, and Bower, but JavaScript development is still immature in the constant evolution as a pace that Bower, for example, may be supplanted by something like JSPM by the time Visual Studio 2015 comes out. We just talked about that too, didn't we? And unless I missed it, Mads didn't talk about support for ES6. He didn't, but we certainly have. I suppose that's where Web Essentials steps in, but it still doesn't compare with the experience offered by Atom or Sublime, where one can fine-tune their setup with smaller, single-purpose plugins. Microsoft has been surprising us a lot in the past few months. My wish is that they announce that Visual Studio post-2015 will be a complete rewrite using .NET all the way. And who knows, when .NET is going to Macs and Linux, maybe Visual Studio will too.
Is that a typical comment?
Sure. I'm just reading what the listener wrote.
Was that just part one of a multi-part comment?
So, Andre, thank you so much for a comment. A .NET Rocks mug is on its way to you, and if you'd like a .NET Rocks mug, write a comment on the website at .NETRocks.com or on any of our mobile apps, as we've got them for iOS, Android, Windows Phone 7 and 8, and Windows 8. Are you ready?
Almost.
You're almost ready?
The mail client doesn't search very well on iPad.
Hey, you're just talking crazy to him.
It's true, but hang on one second. Stall. Actually, let Scott comment on that.
Scott, did you have a comment on the evolution of Visual Studio?
I think that it's been 2015 versions, and I think we just about got it right.
Without a doubt, an ongoing evolution of product. There's no two ways about it. Let's just move on then. All right.
All right, we don't have a Better Know framework today. Sorry about that. We are going to let this esteemed panel introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Cooper on my left.
Okay, so I'm Ian Cooper. I'm a software developer for a company called Huddle in London. And I've been involved in the .NET community since about 2003, so I've seen quite a lot. I'm really happy to be here and talk about the state of play today.
Awesome. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy, and it's my
Microphone's not on.
Here.
Hang on, Amy.
Here.
Oh. This is why we have audio, guys. Oh, wait.
We're good?
No.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
I cleaned it first.
Stop, Amy.
We're on? Okay. So, hi, I'm Amy. I'm a programmer at Hi, I'm Amy, and I'm a programmer at GitHub, and I work on GitHub for Windows, and I'm from New Zealand.
I don't think that, I couldn't hear you. Actually, I don't know what's cooler, though, that you work on GitHub for Windows or that you're from New Zealand. Those are both pretty darn cool.
Close by.
That makes 2 Kiwis.
Oh, wait, that's not going to go back.
No, it's not. Yeah.
It's an impressive gesture.
So we're going to extend the conference by an extra day.
Ding! Ah, there we go.
That was a good button.
Ow! Great. All right. So can I go ahead now?
Go.
Great. Okay, hi, I'm Amy. I'm a programmer at GitHub, and I work on GitHub for Windows, and I'm from New Zealand.
I'm Scott. I've worked at Microsoft almost 7 years. I live in Portland. I've been here for 42 years. And before I worked at Microsoft, I worked in retail banking and brought a lot of open source to large banks.
I'm Serial Seb. I started my love affair with .NET in 2000 with the first beta. I released an open source web framework called OpenRaster back in 2006. I attempted to release a package manager in 2010, and since then I'm on counseling. I write code apparently sometimes.
I am James Nugent from London. I work on a product called Event Store, which is a database written primarily in .NET. It's a time series database that's used a lot for event sourcing.
All right, panelists, let's start with the list of questions, and I want input from everybody on this one. What's the state of open source and .NET community today? I'd love to start with you, James, actually.
Okay, so I think it's important to distinguish between... so I don't think you can say that there's a single state of open source in .NET. This morning was the first time I've actually been excited by an announcement from Microsoft for a very long time. The LLVM compiler for .NET is awesome. Mm-hmm. That will... If they'd done that 5 years ago, I think we'd be looking at a very different state of .NET.
You can applaud for that. I think the LLVM is amazing too.
As it is, there are areas where .NET is very innovative. In particular, front-end development. Some of the patterns that .NET developers have brought to the wider communities are substantial. The MVVM pattern, for example, which seems to have invaded JavaScript. The async and await patterns, which, despite my issues with them, have made their way into ECMAScript. That's all very innovative, and WPF is genuinely probably the best UI platform around for building anything. On the other hand, the distributed systems state is poor. Why do we not have innovation in the same way as the JVM community? And it's hard to tell. I think it's largely the fault of Windows. Hopefully, once we start being able to build things natively and run on operating systems which are not actively hostile to operations, then things will improve substantially. But there must be reasons why things like Zookeeper and Kafka and all these distributed systems which almost all companies working at scale depend on, there must be a reason why they're built on the JVM. And I don't think it's purely because people like the syntax of Java, or even of Scala, frankly. There's more to it than that. And we're not going to fix that anytime soon, sadly.
All takes time.
Right.
Seb, you got position?
Me,
No.
an opinion?
He's
Surely
such a
not.
restrained fellow.
I think there's a fundamental that has not really changed enormously over the last 10 years of open source. there is the state of the open source community separate from Microsoft, and then there's Microsoft. Now, Microsoft has its own story, it's on its own timelines, and now they're doing really cool stuff. They did a lot of not cool stuff for a long time. The rest of the community that lives on the outskirts, that is starting to work with Microsoft on the Microsoft projects, still doesn't seem to be very often full of resources to go their own way. And I think we have a very different, we have a very special open source community. This kind of stuff would have been unheard of back in the old .NET
they're not used
days.
to an open Microsoft at all, are they? They're not used to an open Microsoft at all, are they?
It's very new. It's very new for them. It's very new for us. There's, I think it's like a couple that divorced and is now in counseling.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing for me is not so much Microsoft, because they seem to be doing the right thing now, or at least trying very hard. I think for me it's the rest of the community that could be building things without Microsoft and without needing the permission or the money of Microsoft to do things. That it just doesn't seem to be taking ground the same way it does on other platforms.
Amy, you could come from a different place. Tell us what your background is here and your thoughts on the subject.
Well, I guess my thoughts on the subject are, it kind of feels like the lights have been off for a very long time and they've just suddenly come on and we're all like, oh, open source, what is this? There's like a handful of people that have been involved in open source for the last, 5 to 7 years actively, but the wider community hasn't really been taking part actively. And at this point, I feel like we're just figuring it out, right? We're figuring out what it means as a wider community to contribute to open source projects, as businesses, what it means to contribute to open source projects, and it's going to take some time to figure out.
Definitely in the motion. Scott, I'm going to leave you last because I want to talk to Ian first because, you get to go last.
So I think it is really important to celebrate Microsoft's Road to Damascus moment and the fact that they've chosen to embrace open source. And I think, we are at kind of a turning point for the .NET community where hopefully that means people will feel much more able to deploy open source into their organizations and to feel comfortable contributing towards open source. So I think we have to do that. As I think as a community, we risk irrelevancy if we are not, we don't have a thriving ecosystem. I think there's one other point. We talk a lot about .NET open source, but I think, when people talk about deploying applications, what they need is a full ecosystem, which may include open source products written in other languages. And it doesn't really matter to me whether what Redis is written in, for example. It's important that I can deploy it. So another obstacle to us is this problem of what's the Windows open source ecosystem like? And in some cases, that as Microsoft's working really hard to try and improve that story and putting dollars into pushing those platforms to come onto Windows. But it's also important that we, as .NET developers, have some kind of Linux story, because there's still a huge amount of open source products that you may want to use that run in that environment, not on Windows today.
Right.
And they go hand in hand. We have to have a Windows OSS ecosystem and a .NET OSS ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think that's getting more diverse, too.
It is, yeah.
We're in motion here. Mr. Hanselman.
Sir.
How's the state of the open source community these days in the .NET world?
I want to listen a little longer before I talk,
Okay.
so that I don't misspeak.
Well, I have a scenario for you, and tell me if I'm off the mark here, but it seems like, the operating system, Windows, being what it is and having gone where it's gone, starting with King Sanofsky and that failed attempt to sort of get everybody over to Windows. The idea that Windows should be more free, should be more open, should be, free SKUs at the lower end. Do you think Microsoft sort of got backed in? Any of you can comment on this if you want. Microsoft sort of got backed into that open source thing, or is it a natural progression that started with, guys like Phil Hack and you, Mr. Hanselman, and supporting open source, Scott Guthrie embracing open source?
You have to back up, though, because there's a couple of things that you've set there.
Yeah.
Mac is not free.
Sure.
Mac is not free on the low end.
Right.
Mac is not open source.
Yep.
It does have a POSIX subsystem and has a bash shell, but other than that and being really pretty and having great hardware, it succeeded without being free on the low end.
Yeah.
So this idea that everyone needs to give away Windows for making up for it to be open source, I think, is a fallacy.
Yeah.
That's one opinion.
Okay.
I don't work in the Windows department. Were we backed into it? Again, I've said this before publicly, it's my opinion, but don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetence.
Yeah.
Microsoft is not nearly as organized as we would need to be as evil as you think we are.
Well said, sir. I am surprised at how much in that first set of statements that Windows came up in this. Because at the same time, and Seb, you just did this talk yesterday, talking about Owen, and in general, there's this bigger conversation going on about running .NET on Linux, and not necessarily running Mono. I mean, isn't this a real thing now? Do I, as a systems guy, just not have to think about having Windows when I want to run .NET?
How does Microsoft make money? 10 years ago, it was Windows licenses and Office. And today, it's going to be compute. Right. Microsoft wants to sell you Windows, Office, Xbox. And if you don't want to buy any of those things, well, then maybe you'll run Linux VMs in Azure.
Right.
It's simple as that. It really is. There's no secret. I've been in the secret meetings where the Microsoft people go like this.
You're not invited to the right meetings.
I think I'm at the right meetings, and it's fundamentally, it's services now. You know? So yeah, you run Linux, knock yourself out. And if you run .NET on Linux and do interactive debugging with Sublime on Linux, I don't care. You can run Node on Linux, just run it in Azure.
I'm kind of staggered by the announcements around their Docker implementation already. I'm kind of surprised they got done that fast. Yeah. But now, I think for folks living in the Microsoft stack, we've got to figure out containers in a big hurry, because it's a very different way to think.
It'll be handled. I'm not worried about it.
What's the Silicon Valley reaction to Microsoft's new openness?
Is anyone here from Silicon Valley?
I've seen the TV program.
Am I the only American on the thing?
This is the Commonwealth Mafia.
So do I have to represent Portland and the Bay at the same time?
I think we've got the Queen covered. So.
Yeah. All right. We had a meeting this morning where we were.
All right. Let me hang on. Let me try to get into San Francisco. So basically, no.
I mean, I can say what I can know about from talking to various VCs about startups and what their interest is. I mean, outside of centres like London, I think a bit of New York, maybe places like Austin, where essentially you have a pool of .NET developers from a history of particularly financial services industry. I don't think startups today are looking at the .NET ecosystem as a way to deliver. Today, the kind of tool of choice seems to be Golang. And the question, it is an open question for our community as to what would change that. I think if you're building a startup today, one of the things you're interested in is costs. So you want to have a stack which you know is low cost, free, doesn't lock you into particular IDEs. We're making a lot of inroads. And the OmniSharp project is great, where we're actually trying to liberate people to make that happen. Right now, it's not the obvious choice. But I don't think that says that it couldn't be. There's a lot of most people you talk to say they think C# and F# are really great languages. Mm-hmm. They say the CLR is a pretty good runtime. So there's obviously an obstacle which is stopping them leveraging that and leveraging the pool of talent that exists in .NET. And we have to work to eliminate that. And a lot of that is your startup costs. And programs like BizSpark are great, but really what you need is someone to be able to just download the stuff they need and get started. And that's the problem.
And the open sourcing of the stack is sort of going in that direction, right?
Exactly. It's tooling as well.
Is this really what's going to take the strength in the ecosystem as a whole? I mean, where's the weaknesses?
I think the weaknesses today are I'm quite locked into Visual Studio. We need to break that kind of .NET Visual Studio lock-in. I can't deploy to Linux as well as to Windows. I need to break that part of the model. And I need to feel that from kind of soup to nuts, from a web server to a database to I have a pool of libraries that let me make choices. Today there's quite often only one choice in each of those areas, and that isn't necessarily going to work. I think we're getting much better, but I think as a community we don't necessarily have the vocabulary to say which one of those in which slots would we pick to make those choices. And I think some of us have that, but I don't know whether that's a broad knowledge. So So we run, we deploy on Unix and on Windows, and we run a heavily OSS.NET ecosystem, and we're I guess we're a startup, though we're still under VC funding. And that story's, we've had quite a few success stories in London doing that, but I don't know how common that understanding of how to build that is. And I need to get that knowledge out more.
James?
So I guess I'm slightly unusual in that I've never used Windows as a desktop operating system. So just by
Makes you a rare bird, I would say.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of Mac people
So
here.
now I think there are a lot of Mac users. So I started doing .NET using Vim before OmniSharper was around, I guess 2003, 4 kind of time. And back then that was not much fun, frankly. The language is kind of designed for the language is designed for IntelliSense, which is fair enough, although even in Visual Studio I turn IntelliSense off because it rots the brain, frankly. It allows people to get away with not finishing their job. The documentation is poor. The documentation is the work of technical writers who've never had to use their product and never had to read their own documentation in order to figure out a problem. Now the framework source is available, this is a very different story though, because you can go and work out what the problems are or where the edge cases are. You could never do that before without a decompiler, and you're technically committing a crime at that point.
I'm interested, what documentation are you comparing it to?
There are two that I think are excellent right now. The first is the documentation for Go, which has a great mix of pragmatism and because it's community driven, I guess, in that the documentation is in files that accept pull requests and go via code review. You can. It tends to be that if you have a problem, you can go and look at the documentation. It's a normal thing to do to go and read the documentation rather than just rely on some kind of IntelliSense mapping to get you through of figuring out what's there. And the documentation tends to focus on the actual problems people face on a day-to-day basis.
Got it.
On the other hand, the reason that I think OmniSharp is a big step forward for people who are on .NET. So I was a reasonably early adopter of that. Luckily, because just by chance, because I managed to meet Jason Emerson in a pub in London, and he set it up for me. Because trying to set that thing up used to be a nightmare. It's a lot easier these days.
Just as an edit point, can everybody pull up their microphones and make sure the little top thing is screwed in all the way? Somebody's clicky-clacking.
That'd be me.
Got it. Thanks. Did you want to finish your point there, James? Or?
Did you have a point?
So I think things like OmniSharp will improve the situation in terms of openness. So in terms of Silicon Valley, I think So I started recently working with a company who, everything is built on Java and more recently Go. Everything's deployed on Linux in AWS. I asked about Windows support for this thing, and they looked at me like I was crazy. It's something they genuinely had never considered as a thing.
Just not on the radar.
It's just, it's not there. We do customer surveys to work out what things we should be targeting. We build monitoring systems. And overwhelmingly, the companies that are of the size that are going to pay us any money worth having are not using Microsoft products because they're working at such scale that you can't. Even in the cloud space, so I think the Microsoft Cloud has promise, but it's not there right now. And you can't do things like run a quorum system reliably in it because the number of availability zones was all designed with this master-slave failover type thing of Windows failover clusters in mind. And you can't reliably run a quorum-based system on it. So what are you going to do when you need to run a distributed system? If they move in the direction of the stuff they're doing with Docker is promising. The stuff they're doing with Linux is very promising. There's a lot to be hopeful for with the .NET community. Right? The CLR is excellent. It has things which the JVM does not, like value types, which make certain types of things a lot easier. The language support, I think the CLR introduced the concept of a multi-language runtime, give or take, and that spread very well. But they've never, so they, I guess, as in Microsoft, or we as a community, have never managed to line all these advantages up to actually get them to the point where we can push them home and make this stuff mainstream.
I think that's the main thing, is it feels like the community has been a group of children following their teachers in a little row. I don't know how you say it in English. And now Microsoft is opening the class to the world. And the kids are all looking at the bright lights and not understanding what's going on because there's not a little structure and a little box. When you were a .NET developer, you were a .NET developer. I've stopped being a .NET developer a long time ago. I'm a developer. I happen to like C#. I happen to don't like Windows. Now that .NET is going to be available on Unix, I can actually start pushing more for having the tools I enjoy, and I enjoy statically typed languages, on my platforms. Now, there's the psychological aspect of using Microsoft. You don't change the reputation of a company that has had the past it has had as quickly as you can write .NET for Unix.
So
Right?
I wonder whether, like, we as a community can, like, help to change the perception of being a .NET developer. Like, one of the things that I frequently experience is I'll meet people at conferences and they'll be like, "Wow, you work at GitHub," and I'm like, "Yeah, I work on .NET," and they're like, "Oh," but like really excited until they learn that, and it makes me really sad. It really does. But I feel like that just comes out of ignorance, right? Like, we are, as a .NET community, building a lot of really cool stuff, right? We're pushing boundaries that people just don't even know about, right? And I think it comes down to sharing that in an open source way.
So is there no substitute here than just build more software?
And share it.
Demonstrate what's possible?
Share it.
Yeah.
Make it open source.
Get it out there?
I think we don't talk about our community successes enough as well. I mean, James is talking about the back-end innovation, but I think it's important to remember that, you know, people like Greg Young with ideas like CQRS and event sourcing, those have flowed out right across the board into other communities like Java. And I expect half those guys don't know that the .NET community were the real champions of those ideas in the first place. I think the other danger for us is that we have to be careful when we look at the wider .NET community. There's this, you know, the thing they talk about, the chasm which you have to cross in terms of adoption. And I guess for a lot of people, part of the issue is we have to say, well, what, you know, I'm doing my job day to day, delivering something in .NET. Why do I need any of this open source ecosystem? How does it make my life easy? Why would I invest in it? We do have to win that argument of saying to people, hey, there's a load of open source tooling out there which is really valuable to you to actually solve problems that you have today in terms of delivering to your customers. And that's a lot about, I think, creating awareness around those projects and what value they have. And I think the fact that Microsoft is, you know, now very much engaged in the open source community means, so I think we need to hope that they begin to look at championing those projects as ways of solving problems instead of necessarily proposing their own alternatives. And that's one thing that I think we, you know, when we look at the past, that was genuinely potentially a problem was we saw community projects struggling to try and gain traction, written by people who are very enthusiastic and positive about open source, kind of being crushed a bit by the Microsoft gorilla. And then we talked about this before, I think, quite a lot. And we need to really hope that in going forward, I know Scott's been a real, you know, champion of OSS projects, and I think he's done some great work to really try and get the word out there. But we all need to really work on trying to say, hey, there's this community project that solves that problem, so let's just all support that community project and solve that problem. You know, we saw some really great demos from the Akka.NET guys while we've been here, really impressive stuff. And we really need to get behind, as a community, people like doing stuff like Akka and say, well, look, we do have a Akka-based solution. Let's all, when people are asking those questions, let's all say, go and talk to the Akka guys. They know what's going on. Let's not try and essentially, you know...
Don't build another one.
Yeah.
No need to. I guess one of the questions on this then is, how much of this effort is about bringing open source to, quote, traditional .NET developers, and how much of this is bringing .NET to open source developers?
I think there's a bit of both at work there. So if you go back to sort of 2005-06 sort of time, the large rump of dark matter developers, such as they've become known, were not interested in anything that didn't come out the Visual Studio installer, right? Now, these days, it's a lot more common for people to use open source tooling just in the day-to-day course of their work. So how many people, for example, work on a back-end in .NET, but use Node Package Manager for pulling in front-end packages, for example? So I think some of the community is coming to those people just as a natural consequence of people building modern web apps rather than you know, web forms and that kind of thing. On the other hand, there's a large rump, not a rump, I guess there's a large group of people who are excited about the CLR and who build distributed systems and who are really, frankly, tired of the JVM. I mean, despite Oracle are doing their best to kill that, as far as I can tell. There is literally no excuse for adding in the Ask Toolbar installer. This is, it's 2015. What are we doing? So I think if .NET becomes, if the promise that's shown by things like the LLVM compiler bear out, and there isn't some kind of change in direction a little later, as has been previously the case, then I think the .NET will spread very rapidly, in a very far-reaching manner, and the discussion in 5 years' time here will be very different.
Yeah, Scott, you're brooding there like you have something roiling going on in your brain that you need to get out.
I think that the people in this room probably represent the top 0.5% of developers. And with respect to the people on the panel as well, I think that your job is not to think about the other 99.5%. And that is literally my job. I know that some people don't like the term that I coined called dark matter developer, but that is a thing. And while I understand that high-end startups are going with Go, the reality is I'm not worried about Go. I'm worried about PHP.
Yeah.
I was at 2 colleges in Atlanta a couple of days ago at hackathons, and it was a mix of Macs and a mix of PCs. It was a largely non-denominational crowd, and people used Python and PHP. So for every Go system being built, I suspect that there are probably 10 or 20 PHP ones. So I just want to make sure that people don't forget the great unwashed, and that they need our help as well. So while we are having trouble building quorum-based distributed systems in Azure, there are people who are trying to get CRUD done in PHP, and I'd like to get those people on Azure and maybe using .NET. So I just want to point out the difference in priorities of people on the panel and the people in the room.
And Microsoft can market to both groups.
Absolutely.
And
I think to his point,
I thought we were talking about open source.net, not Microsoft. I think that's a key point. We're talking about growing open source in .NET. We're not talking about Microsoft selling products.
Yeah.
So when we say that your job is to market PHP developers to get them on web pages or whatever it is these days that exist on that platform, my job as an open source developer is to grow the open source community so that Microsoft doesn't have to provide the product.
Well,
Microsoft doesn't have to provide the web page.
my job is
marketing.
to get opensource.net as part of the conversation. Because when a 15-year-old goes to the Flatiron School to learn coding, they sit down and they write Java, Go, PHP, Python at the command line, and .NET isn't there. So my job is to get that 15-year-old to use .NET, not to get these 35-year-olds to use it.
So you could almost say that marketing for open source is just publishing it and getting more people to contribute it.
Attractive, easy, non-threatening to download, flexible, open, and reliable.
It's about creating the content and maintaining it, not about
like to the
marketing.
point of like if someone wants to go and write something in Go today, it's a great quick download, and they've got Hello World in 5 minutes. But you know, on Microsoft, it's okay. Here's 2 gig ISO. I want to.
It's 8 gigabytes for Visual Studio Community Edition. I know this because I've been trying to build machine images for it for quite some time. It won't install over a remote connection.
We will solve that.
Good.
It will be. You will be able to this time next year download in some small 2-digit number of megabytes a non-threatening size .NET download, do useful stuff on it, deploy it on Linux, and do interactive debugging.
That's great. That's what it.
It will be
means.
okay.
On the other hand, there's been a tendency, I think.
Scott, so what you're saying is Silverlight is back? See what I did?
It's going to be called Heavy Gold, and it's much better. Wait till you see the data grid.
All right.
To echo some of Scott's point there, I mean, I can quite often make the point that if you're it applies in Java as well as .NET, there's a huge weight of 10 years of ecosystem and different ways and approaches of solving particular problems. And what we do need is the ability to recognize that if somebody new is coming to the platform, questions as simple as, well, what do I use to do data access, are very difficult. We don't really have some clear set out place where we can go and say, okay, this is how you do all this particular piece of work, and this is how you solve that problem today, and ignore all the other stuff. And I think one of the potential wins of something like .NET Core is this ability to break with that kind of past legacy. I mean, Microsoft have been great at supporting legacy for enterprise customers, but new people want to say, hey, I want a clearer set of choices, and I want a clearer set of documentation that says, this is how I build a .NET app today, and I don't really want to worry about that past.
Yeah, I feel like we're perpetually pressed against the legacy now. We've had the opportunity to have a couple of interviews with some really quite new developers who see software very differently when they're working in the Microsoft stack. And you know, I feel like everybody certainly on this panel, walking around with some serious scars. You know, the price of these years.
We are.
Yes, we are.
The young people aren't.
Are not.
And to his point, that we need to introduce them in a way that is prescriptive and comforting and welcoming.
Right. To do that, you need some kind of clear consensus over even a good way to do things. So one of the things that you find in the Go community is that the mailing list, the people who maintain this language and who write the standard library will answer questions on the mailing list saying, that's not how it was intended to be used, do it this way instead, and you'll have a much better time.
Will that scale, though, to 10 million developers?
I don't know. Hopefully it will. But that's the kind of thing that I think you find a lot more in more mature open source communities. It's also the kind of thing you find a lot more in the F# community rather than the C# based .NET
honest question, not a troll.
Yeah.
You said more mature open source communities. The people may be more mature, but wouldn't it be fair to say that all of those are an order of magnitude smaller? So maybe niche is not meant to be diminutive, but in smaller, more insular communities can have a developer. When Ruby was coming up and Rails were coming up, sure, DHH would answer questions, but you're not getting tech support from him anymore.
Absolutely, no. But on the other hand, he's also not trying to sell something. I think it's reasonably short-sighted to suggest that things like Ruby and PHP and Node are niche. I mean, they power probably 95 to 99% of startups in the US today, and probably worldwide. Between that and Java, I think close to 99.9% is my guess. It's a rather arbitrary number, but these things are not niche. The reasons. So the question that I have is whether one thing can suitably serve everybody. So is it useful to have the same product that people use for building distributed systems versus the same thing that they use to build their blog, right? And traditionally, I think that .NET has aimed where the money is, which is quite a reasonable thing to do for a commercial company. And they've done that at the expense of people who wanted to build innovative things. And that seems to be changing. It genuinely seems to be changing. If you can now run this thing on Linux, you can now build it with tools that don't make you want to kill yourself every time you open them. You can...
See, why do statements like that helpful?
Well, it depends.
I mean, seriously. Like, I hear what you're saying because I feel like 75% of what you're saying I agree with. And then 25% is either elitist or mean.
So I don't think it's either elitist or mean.
I think that when you say that a tool makes you want to kill yourself, that is by definition elitist and mean.
I thought it was by definition Visual Studio opening times.
I'm sorry? What I'm saying is, if you want to help build a community, kindness and appreciation for choice is an important factor in that.
I agree. Appreciation for choice is absolutely a requirement to do anything in that space. If people choose to use Visual Studio, that's great. They can do that.
Well, it wasn't great 2 sentences ago, though, is my point. So
so using Visual Studio, every time I open Visual Studio, I reevaluate whether I should go and work on a farm castrating pigs. Right?
So you are literally making my point for me right now.
This is something...
on our side of the pond...
If there are people in the audience who are new to .NET 2 or 3 years, and I know that they are, I think that they're going to think, gosh, this is not really good. We can't get along on at least pick the tool that makes you happy.
The question is, does it have to? Right? There doesn't have to be a single solution to this. But it's perfectly so that if you go and look at the wars between editors in the past, the Emacs Vim war, for example, there's never going to be. These people are never going to accept that one thing is the best.
What you describe as a war, I describe as a choice, and I respect their choice. I don't think of it as being a war.
And I think generally when people are trying to get into software, they're not trying to get into a war. They're trying to make cool shit, right? Am I allowed to say that?
You can definitely say that.
They just want to make cool things, right?
We're going to have to add a beep.
Right.
Beep. You can copy that over that.
We had to beep the Kiwi.
Right? Who wants to start a war when they just want to start a blog, right?
I tell you, 15-year-old kids that are doing a startup don't want to argue about religious zealotry.
Right, yeah.
So my point I'm making is evangelize Emacs, evangelize Vim, or whatever makes you happy, but do it in a way that doesn't diminish another person's choice.
Yeah.
I think this is a place where, like, as a .NET community, we have a really important role to play in setting up what our community needs to look like, right? Like, when new people are coming in and they're figuring out how they can contribute to open source projects, things like this, how we treat each other, how we speak to each other, our appreciation for our ability to choose is a really important consideration when we're speaking with each other in an open source community.
I think we all need to get along. Rodney King said it best when he said, "Ow, stop that. It hurts."
Yeah, we're going to need to beep that as well.
Absolutely. That was just for you guys.
I think potentially, we do see that there is this churn in kind of the language du jour that people want to use. And it may well be, to that point, to Scott's point, that one of the reasons is because newer languages on the block are being very welcoming because they're trying to build community. And then after a certain amount of time, once they have an established foothold and a number of players in it, they can lose sight of that need to attract people in, and they become much less welcoming. I think we've seen a lot of things come and fade. So maybe, that is a real challenge this community needs to accept, to saying we need to welcome people in. We need to, if you're building OSS projects, you need to make it really easy for someone to say, hey, I want to join in, I want to raise an issue, and I want to get a reasonable response to the issue that I raise that's basically respectful. I want to be able to raise a PR and be treated in a respectful way when I raise a PR. I don't want to participate in... We have to encourage that participation, right?
All right, we have time for one question for each of the panel. And it is, what .NET open source project do you think more people need to know about? James.
I think probably actually Reactive UI.
Reactive?
So Reactive UI is built on top of...
Awesome.
It's built on top of reactive extensions, which is another thing that .NET has given to the wider world that all originated here, right? The Reactive UI is, without question, the best way of building user interfaces, and it's inspired all kinds of other projects elsewhere.
Seb?
I would hope that there will be great suggestions from other people, so I would recommend people actually just get involved by talking, chatting, pull requesting, commenting, being rude if you want, being polite if you want. Let the system select itself, not by judging, criticizing, or belittling, but by engaging. Let the people that fuck up at engaging disappear naturally out of the system instead of preventing them from existing. That's Absolutely. What I want.
Scott?
What?
Open source project you think more people should know about?
I think that people should know that there are open source projects.
That's a good thing.
I think that very often I'll meet people, even whether it be inside Microsoft or outside, who will say, oh, I'm working on foo, and then I'll talk, oh, that's great, that sounds just like Project Bar. And I'll talk, and then they'll go, what's Bar? I've never heard of that. And it's simply because they never lifted their heads up and looked around. So what open source .NET projects should people look at? They should look at all of them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Amy?
Well, James took my favorite project,
Reactive.
So I'm going to have to recommend that people check out my second favorite project, which is OctaKit, which Brendan in the back there works on and Phil works on, and they do a fantastic job. If you want to have a good example of like how to build a community and how to interact with people, I really recommend you read the issues and the pull requests that are being raised there. Come and contribute. Exactly.
Right. Ian?
I think probably the ThinkTexture stuff. The guys there doing a lot of work with identity, etc. And I think that's a really, really impressive project. People should go and look at.
Very good. And that's the last word. Ian's got it. So big round of applause for our panel. And we'll see you next time on